This week in pre-AP Comp Sci, we're going to introduce the concept of lists using Scratch. And what it simply could be is a list of numbers or a list of words, and initially we'll be working with numbers. So let's look at Lab 1, the basics. Write a program that will use a list. The list will store a group of random numbers, and then sum up that list of numbers. So we have a couple things to do. We got to create a list. We have to put a series of random numbers in the list, and then we have to add them all up. So not only do we need to create a list, but we're going to have to create a couple of variables that help us navigate the list. And this is going to be real common for this week's labs. So we'd go to the variables data section and make a list named numbers. Remember, that's orange section on Scratch. Numbers will be used by all the sprites and will be used to store the list of random numbers. Next step will be adding code so that when the green flag is clicked, 10 random numbers ranging from 1 to 50 are added to the list. So you can see that those numbers likely range from 1 to 50 by looking at the sample. Adding code so that when the space bar is pressed, all numbers are removed from the list. So we got to clean up the list too, and that's another important thing to know how to do. Then adding code so that when the down arrow is pressed, all numbers are added to a variable named sum. And this is a concept that's going to take a second to grasp. So let's kind of talk about it. When you need to add up the numbers, you need to visit each location in the list and pull out its data. So if you think of this list of 1 through 10 right here, this is your spot in the list or your count. This lab uses count. Our future labs use the term spot. I really like that better because spot number 1 in the list contains 48. And that's the item in the list. So we have a spot, 1 through 10, and we have items in our list, which are going to be the numbers between 1 and 50, randomly generated by Scratch. And that's an important concept. Maybe you want to back up the video and listen to that again. But let's get into Scratch. So in Scratch, we have to go to our variables section. And here we can make variables, we can make lists, and then blocks or something for later on. So let's make our list. Today, let's call it random, because we're going to put random numbers in it. And notice this list is now empty. Down in the corner, I can resize the visual portion of my list. And then we're going to need a variable to count. And we're going to need a variable, if we go back to our instructions, named sum to sum up all of the values. So let's make a variable called sum. Now the first thing we have to do is we have to generate the list. And we're launching the list generation. Go to the variables, adding code so when the green flag is clicked, 10 random numbers from 1 to 50 are generated. All right, so green flag click. Let's grab that. I'm going to make this a little bigger. It said something about random numbers. Let's do some random. It said 1 to 50 is our range. And it said 10 numbers. So we need to go through and generate 10 numbers. And we need to put them in the list. So to do something 10 times repeatedly, we can use a repeat loop. Now here's where it gets a little tricky. We need to come back down to our list commands. You notice when you create a variable, it creates 4 different blocks of code. Well, when we made a list, it made quite a few new blocks of code. And we want to add things to random. This thing would be replaced by a variable name, potentially. We could clean up our list item by item. We can delete the whole list. We can insert, like placing something in the middle of a list or a specific location of a list. And if we use an insert, it can make the list bigger. If we use replace, the same number of items will be in the list, but an item will be changed. And so we want to look at what are some of these options that we can use. So item number of our list is something we have to think about. And what we want to plug in here is going to be our counter, because we're going to count 1 through 10 as we fill our list with random numbers. But we have to generate those numbers first. So right here, as you can see, we can pick random 1 through 50 and add them to the list. It's an alternate way of doing that. We're going to use this item count in a later portion of the lab. So here, just to build our list, we're going to put random numbers in it. All right, that's the end of step 1. Part 2 of our lab says to add in code so that when the spacebar is pressed, all numbers are removed from the list. And we do have more than one way to do this. Probably the most direct way to do this, if there's no other requirements of you working on the list, is you can simply delete all from the list. But we do have another way of doing that we could build. And I thought I'd take a second and show you. Sometimes you have to go through and clean out your list item by item. So when you have to do that, you're going to need a repeat loop. And the size of the repeat directly corresponds to the size of the list. So you have to look at the length of the list and delete every item in the list. And so we have to delete item 1 of random, but what we need to do here is actually be using a counter. So our counter is going to be set to 1, and we're going to delete position 1, and then we're going to continue deleting item count from the list. And so the next thing we do is increment count by 1 so that the next time through it's position 2 in the repeat loop. I'm sorry, this goes in here. Change count by 1. It now becomes 2, and I can delete the items in the list. So as count changes, it deletes the next item in the list until the list is empty, because we're letting it interpret the length of the list. This is an important routine for future labs as well. So you kind of want to keep that in your back pocket. Okay, so the next part is when the down arrow is pressed, all of the numbers are added to a variable named sum, which we've already set up. And what you have to remember is we have to specify the location or the count, but we have to pull out the item or the contents of the list. And so that's going to get a little tricky, and we'll be referring to this location as its spot in the list. And then these are the items that are contained in the list. So it's going to be real critical that you gain a quick understanding of what we're doing. And you can see that this list added up to 227. So let's take a look at how to do this. Now we want to do, when down arrow key is pressed, we want to reset our sum to 0 anytime we run this so that we get the true value of the current list. And I want to set my count to 0 because this is going to give us the most true way of approaching the problem. I know I need to repeat 10 times going through my list, and each time I go through my list, I'm going to change my count by 1 so that I start at position 1. But remember, we found out that repeat 10, we can also enhance that a little bit to be a little more flexible. We could make that the length of the list, and then it'll visit every position. But we still need to specify what item we're going to by using a count variable. So now we have to change the sum by the item count. Remember, count is the spot in the list in the random list. So if I were to clear my list, generate a new list, and then press my down arrow, I now find that there's 10 items in my list and they add up to 204. That's the lab. So now you got to apply these concepts and explore using these commands in the rest of the labs. This is the introductory lesson, and we're all done with that for today.